Tonight we're talking about Daniel chapter 4, the conversion of a king. It was a long road for Nebuchadnezzar. From the time he conquered Jerusalem, well, when I say conquered Jerusalem, when he took the captives to Babylon, that was in 605, 604 BC. And it's been many years now that have passed that we have the story of his second dream. And we are going to be reading it, first of all, chapter 4, and then we will get right into the story behind the story. I'll try to share as much as possible of what I have gleaned in my study of this chapter. Chapter 4 of Daniel. So I will read. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language. I must mention that this chapter was written by Nebuchadnezzar, not Daniel. And I don't know how Daniel got the script, but Nebuchadnezzar was the one who wrote it. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth. May you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. You remember the first dream? He didn't remember it. This dream, he remembered it, but he wanted the interpretation. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, and that was the Babylonian name, after the name of my God. That's what Nebuchadnezzar is saying now. And the spirit of the holy gods is in him. Now, what he's saying here was he is just relating the experience before his conversion. I said, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From every creature was fed. Every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times or 7 years pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belshazzar, Daniel, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. Not that he didn't know the interpretation, but the dream was not what he expected, and he was a little bit unsettled about the interpretation. But he was going to tell Nebuchadnezzar in any case. So the king said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream could apply to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, the tree that you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. Nebuchadnezzar, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. That is why it says that the tree could be seen from all over the world, as it were. Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. This iron and bronze, the practice back there was that they would tie a piece of iron or bronze around the trunk of the tree to prevent it from splitting. And so I think they just carried over the custom in the wording here. It says, let him be drenched with dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 years pass by for him. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from your people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times or 7 years will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Isn't it interesting that it took 12 months after the dream, and then he was still proud, still boastful, still arrogant? Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 years will pass by until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Now, you will remember that as I shared with you, Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar came to the place where he honored the God of Daniel, but then drifted back into his old ways of worshiping idols. But here in chapter 4, there is no indication that Nebuchadnezzar went back to his old ways. We believe that this caused his conversion. Now, as I said, Daniel 4 is a personal testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. He wrote this chapter about 30 years after the fiery furnace experience. And the fiery furnace experience was 10 years after the captives went from Jerusalem to Babylon. We realize in this chapter that God gave Nebuchadnezzar a second dream. This time the king did not forget the dream, but because the wise men failed again, the king called Daniel to interpret the dream. In the dream, the king sees a big tree reaching up to heaven and a command that the tree be chopped down. Only the stump and roots would be left in the earth and would be wet with the dew of heaven. Nebuchadnezzar already had encountered at least 3 opportunities to understand that all his accomplishments should be credited to the God of heaven. In the first 3 chapters, you remember those experiences. But because he did not learn his lesson, God gave him another lesson to help him understand the difference between pride and humility. Trees are commonly used in the Bible as symbols of kings, nations, and empires. 19 years before Nebuchadnezzar had his dream about the tall tree, Ezekiel was inspired to tell the Pharaoh of Egypt that God likened him to a tall tree. He also told him that God was planning to cut him down. So that's just one example of many in the Old Testament where kings, nations, empires are likened to trees. Daniel was very careful to explain that the tree represented the king himself. God would remove him from the throne unless he changed his attitude towards his people. The time had come for Nebuchadnezzar to be held accountable for his pride and arrogance. In other words, God was saying to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, enough is enough. Enough is enough. Daniel not only interpreted the dream, but also pointed Nebuchadnezzar to a way out of his situation. Daniel said, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps, Nebuchadnezzar, there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. Now, the wise men probably did not think that the dream could refer to Nebuchadnezzar. It simply would not have occurred to them that a king so rich and powerful and famous could suffer such an affliction. At the time, mental illness was thought to be the work of demons. And how could demons afflict a man so obviously blessed by the gods? Now, you remember we mentioned that there in Babylon they had several gods. So the wise men, they were saying, it could not be. Nebuchadnezzar is blessed. The gods are taking care of him. Therefore, Daniel's interpretation was contrary not only to what the wise men thought about Nebuchadnezzar, but to the very beliefs that the people held to in those days. But what must have troubled Nebuchadnezzar, in addition to the tree being chopped down, was the part of the dream in which the heavenly being said, "Let his heart be changed from that of a man, let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 years pass over him." When we get later on in the chapter of Daniel, you will see that they use the word times as a reference to years. But the king was not willing to set aside his arrogance and change his ways. Even after the dream, even after the interpretation, the impact of the warning in the dream faded away. As month after month passed by, Nebuchadnezzar sensed no immediate danger and wondered why in the world he was so fearful of that mysterious dream. He again indulged in his pride and ambitions by ignoring the poor and the oppressed and spending all his resources on enlarging and beautifying Babylon. If you were to read the history of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, you will discover that he was not kind to the poor people and to the orphans and to the widows. These were groups that he really did not pay attention to. He was more concerned about the rich, the famous, and where he lived, expanding Babylon just in order for him to be great. And so that is why in the dream, you notice the poor and the oppressed, they are mentioned, because this was one of the serious sins that he was involved in. 1 year, 12 months after he had the dream, he was walking on the roof of his palace and saying to himself, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Let us pause here for a moment to talk about Babylon. Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is not this the great Babylon that I have built?" Nebuchadnezzar had enlarged and made Babylon very beautiful. He had built 3 palaces, each one very luxurious. One of them had a roof with a garden of exotic trees and shrubs, flowers everywhere. As a matter of fact, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. If you were to go and look that up on the web, you will see that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is about 2 or 3 on the list. But it had to be very, very spectacular in order for it to be included as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, in addition to that, he had expressed his gratitude to the gods by erecting 53 temples, that's in Babylon, 955 small sanctuaries, 384 altars in the streets. So one might say that Babylon was a very religious city, but it was all to the gods of Babylon. Also, when they went and did excavation of the site where Babylon was, they found the bricks that built the palaces and the walls. And what do you think was was inscribed on the brick? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. That is what they found on the bricks. So you can see the arrogance of this king. Even on the bricks that built the city, he had his name and his title stamped on each brick. There is an inscription in the Berlin Museum, there in Germany, that reveals Nebuchadnezzar's pride and also his backsliding into paganism. It is recorded that he said, and let me read for you now. Remember last week I talked about these clay tablets and how that is what they wrote on. Nebuchadnezzar had written on this clay tablet, "No king among all kings has ever created or ever built what I have magnificently built for Marduk." Remember Marduk? One of the chief, well, I shouldn't say one of, it was the chief god in Babylon. "All my valuable works, the beautification of the sanctuaries of the great gods, I undertook more than any other king." You know, everything Nebuchadnezzar was saying, everything he did was arrogant and proud. Think of it, friends. Nebuchadnezzar probably never handled a brick in his life. He had not participated in the work of building Babylon. It had been built by the sweat of the nameless thousands of oppressed slaves, immigrants, and other poor sections of the nation. But he was saying, look at this wonderful Babylon that I have built. Such a lie. Maybe he supervised it, but he never lifted a finger to put a brick in place. Now let's go back to the story. As soon as Nebuchadnezzar made the statement about his greatness, at that very moment, that's 12 months later, a whole year passed by since he had the dream and the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar was afflicted by a mental disease, possibly a mental disorder known as lycanthropy or zoanthropy. I have to ask Dr. Inandan if I pronounced that correctly. Now, in which a person thinks he or she has become an animal and behaves accordingly. This condition is extremely rare. Only 56 cases of clinical zoanthropy could be found in the international scientific literature. One such case was reported in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry and Clinical Neurosciences. A 20-year-old man was admitted to a mental hospital due to his increasingly agitated and erratic behavior. He had no previous psychiatric history. Over the next few days, he displayed increasingly psychotic, animal-like behaviors. These behaviors included howling loudly, running abruptly, crawling on all fours. When asked about these behaviors, he was initially evasive, but eventually admitted that he believed he was a wolf and would periodically transform himself into a wolf. He started believing this after having visions of the devil, he said, which was years before. And he reported that he heard random voices. The patient was given, I have to correct that. The patient was given a drug called ziprasidone, and his symptoms gradually responded, and his animal-like behaviors eventually ceased altogether. And that is the footnote there where you can find this experience. So this is just one case of that's reported in the journal of zoanthropy. Now, a Babylonian clay tablet was discovered in the ruins of Babylon, which describes Nebuchadnezzar's madness. So we just read the chapter describing his madness, but this clay tablet has some additional information about Nebuchadnezzar's experience. The text states, the king gave contradictory orders, refused to accept counsel, showed love neither to son nor daughter, neglected his family, and no longer performed his duties as head of state. And he weeps bitterly to Marduk, his god. That corresponds to the madness or the insanity that chapter 4 describes. And it was found right there on the clay tablet. Now, for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar had to live among the beasts of the field. Now, as a boy, when I read this story in the book of Daniel, I was very troubled because I'd never heard of any illness like this. And so after doing the studies and research and found out that, yes, it is possible, it just built my faith in the book of Daniel. So after 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar had to live among the beasts of the field. Thus, the one who thought himself to be a god became less than human. As scripture says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Nebuchadnezzar learned the lesson God designed for him. You might ask the question, how did Nebuchadnezzar manage to hold on to his throne for 7 years in spite of his madness, his insanity? This would have been an ideal time for another king to assassinate Nebuchadnezzar and take the throne from him. It must be remembered that God promised Nebuchadnezzar that he would return to the throne if he repented. However, another probable reason why no one even tried to capture the throne is because it had to do with the ancients' view of mental illness. Those living at that time believed that mental illness was caused by demons. They also believed that if a person was deliberately killed while suffering from insanity, the demon god who had caused the mental illness would cause it to come upon the murderer. I hope that is plain, because I didn't know that before reading the history. Therefore, no one would risk getting mental illness by killing a person who was suffering from mental illness. But again, we also know that God predicted that he would be restored to his throne if he repented. Now, after 7 years among the beasts, the king had a radical change of attitude. This is what he said: I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. This look upward signaled a shift in Nebuchadnezzar's mindset. Formerly, the king used to look down upon people from the height of his pride. Now he was looking up. Think for a moment. Even the appearance of the fourth man in the fiery furnace did not change the course of his life. Only after God took him away from his kingdom and sent him to live with the beasts of the field did the king recognize his true sinful state. Now, what lessons can we learn from Daniel chapter 4? What lessons are there for us? Number one, the first lesson. God has a special place in his heart for the poor and the oppressed, the widows, the orphans. It is not surprising that from the other possible sins that God could have revealed to Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar, God singled out the sin of neglecting the poor and the oppressed. The other sin, of course, that God identified was the sin of pride. But this matter of not being kind to the poor and the oppressed was huge in the sight of God. That is why it was identified in Daniel chapter 4. The word poor embraces the widows, orphans, and those others who are destitute of financial means and resources. After all, compassion for the poor is the highest expression of Christian charity. On the other hand, exploitation and neglect of the poor constitutes an attack on God himself because they are his beloved children. I want you to think about that for a moment. As you read the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, you will come across several passages that talks about God's love for the poor. And it is implicit there that we need to take care of his other children. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, am I doing all that I can to help God's other children? And if we find ourselves in the position of the poor and the oppressed, I hope that the others will look at you and say, I need to stretch out my hand and help this person because he or she is a child of God. There is a spiritual truth that is evident here in Daniel chapter 4. In caring for the needy, we recognize that God owns everything, which means that we are not owners, but merely stewards of God's property. That's where we get the word stewardship from. He gives us the means to take care of his other children. Those of us with means should ask ourselves, what am I doing to help God's children who are less privileged? And only you, only Orville, Jean, we are the only ones who can tell if we have extra means to give to help those who are in need. God will inspire us. God will impress us as to how much we need to give and to whom we need to give. Now, the second point, God does not delight in the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Any gifts we have and anything that we have accomplished with those gifts come only from God. Therefore, how can we be proud, boastful, or arrogant when, in reality, humility should dominate all that we do? Anything that we are, whatever we have accomplished, it was God who accomplished it in our lives. But for some people, I did it. Nebuchadnezzar, look at me, the great king. Look at what I have built. Look at this kingdom. Pride is one of the less condemned feelings by human beings, although one of the most detestable in God's eyes. We talked about pride last week, and you can go back and look at the notes from last week and get an idea of what we talked about. That is why in these presentations, I don't have the presentations in outline form. I have written out the script so that you can go back and you can read what I have to share with you. Now in Proverbs 21:4, a haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin. Now, we understand what haughty look and a proud heart means. It's talking about pride. But what does plowing of the wicked means? If you look at the translation and the interpretation, it just means the actions of the wicked. Why is it so difficult for a human being to become humble? Why? And when I say this, I have to talk about myself too. I have to look at myself and say, Orville, what about your pride? It is because we are all infected with the desire to be served and praised, which is nothing more than the desire to be treated like God. Perhaps what's so dangerous about pride is that it can lead us to forget just how dependent we are upon God for everything. That is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Only until he went into the field for 7 years that he looked up and said, okay, it's you, God, it's not me. You are the one that made me who I am. You helped me build Babylon. I have to give you all the praise now, God. You did it. Once we forget that we are on dangerous spiritual ground, referring to the fact that everything we have comes from God, once we forget that, we are on dangerous spiritual ground. Now, why is it that we want to be number one? You might have heard it said, I am looking out for number one. That is referring to yourself. I am looking out for number one. But that place is already occupied. Pride is putting ourselves where God belongs. God is number one. You're not looking out for number one in reality, in a spiritual sense. God is number one. The third point, God is the supreme ruler of this world. Great changes can happen in our lives when we lift our eyes to heaven, as Nebuchadnezzar did. I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. God has a personal appeal for each one of us tonight. In Isaiah 45, he says, look to me and be saved, all you earth, for I am God, and there is no other. Whatever trials we face, whatever obstacles we encounter in this life, we need to understand that the only answer is found in looking up to where our help comes from, and that is God. Did you notice the last thing that was recorded about Nebuchadnezzar's life was not words of boasting, but humble words of praise and gratitude To God, nothing mattered to him anymore as much as his belief and trust in God. If God was able and eager to accomplish this mighty miracle in the life and witness of a heathen king, do you not think that he is able and eager to accomplish the same in the lives and witness of you and me? God can save any sinner that holds on to the grace from heaven. Ephesians 2, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Isn't it comforting to know that God will do whatever it takes to turn us around? God never gave up on Nebuchadnezzar. He will never give up on you. He will never give up on me. He allowed Nebuchadnezzar a whole year after the dream to forsake sin and do right. Micah 6:8 summarizes the experience of Nebuchadnezzar beautifully. He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Put your name in that blank as you read this sentence, this verse with me. The Lord has told you, Orville, and this is the paraphrase in the New Contemporary Version of the Bible. The Lord has told you, Orville, what is good. He has told you what he wants from you. To do what is right to other people, love being kind to others, and live humbly, obeying your God.